Welcome back to the Nick Nice Show. We have an amazing guest with us today. She's a criminal defense attorney who's also been a public defender, a civil servant who ran for the state representative in Georgia and has been involved with issues including the militarization of police and knowing your rights. With us today, we have Catherine Bernard. Welcome to the Nick Nice Show. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me, Nick.
It's my pleasure. We have so much to cover, but first, can you tell us about you, where you're from, and how you grew up?
Well, I grew up in Virginia, but came down to Georgia to go to Emory and fell in love. Moved back down here after law school, and I've worked at big law firms. I've worked at a public defender's office. I'm now out on my own, though I still do a lot of work for the public defender system.
Now, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is what's going on in Ferguson. What's your general feeling about what you've seen there?
Well, it was inevitable. This kind of violence is going to happen when we have the level of police militarization that we're currently facing. And a lot of people are shocked by it, but these are people who haven't seen it happening in their neighborhoods for years now.
There are so many different layers to this case, but I want to start up with Mike Brown's position. Many folks that are approached by the police often don't know their rights. As a criminal attorney, can you tell our audience what rights do we have in general as citizens when being approached by the police?
Absolutely. It's important to remember that encounters between police and members of the public, there's three different categories. The first is a consensual encounter. In that kind of circumstance, the officer can ask you anything he wants, but you have the right to walk away at any time. The second kind of encounter is when the officer has a suspicion, a reasonable suspicion. He can detain you while he investigates that suspicion. In that case, you're not free to leave, but you're not under arrest. In the third category, an arrest or a search, if the officer has probable cause to think that you have committed a crime, at that point, he can take you into custody and search your person. When he's just detaining you, he can only pat down your clothing to feel for weapons or anything that might be a danger.
What many have noticed in the wake of this whole Mike Brown situation is the militarization of local police. What do you think about that and how the police have handled the situation?
Well, from the beginning, there have been a lot of troubling reports. Journalists getting arrested, people getting subjected to violence, being shot with rubber bullets that have caused a lot of damage, people being tased, people being subjected to other kinds of violence from the police. And what's also troubling is the no-fly zone over Ferguson, which means we're not getting reports from news helicopters or other ways that we might trust to find out what's going on. And that's the kind of order that does come from the very highest levels to approve a no-fly zone.
How did we get to the point that our local police are starting to look like military and act like military personnel?
That's a great question, Nick, and I will never be able to do it justice as the book Rise of the Warrior Cop by Radley Balko will. So I recommend to everybody watching this, please do yourself a favor and read Rise of the Warrior Cop by Radley Balko, because he really does a very exhaustive history of law enforcement in the United States and how we ended up with Mayberry back in the 50s, and now we're facing police in riot gear on the streets with weapons of war. But the short answer is the drug war. The drug war has resulted in a lot more people being designated as criminals, and it's also resulted in a lot of federal funding coming in for this kind of military gear. So you can have a mine-resistant armored personnel carrier that would ordinarily cost almost $1 million, and it's getting sold to a local police department for $3,000 or $5,000. So when you have all these toys around, the temptation is to use it. So that's how we ended up becoming more and more militarized. I think it was very, very incremental. 9/11 also was a big factor, and the war on terror, which sort of brought the idea that the homeland was itself a battlefield, that brought that into the political consciousness.
Another thing that has happened since is a surplus of supplies and gear that the military is basically giving to the local police forces. What do you think about that and how that has affected the police mindset when it comes to, community policing?
I think it gives people the impression that the police and individuals in the community are on different sides, that they're soldiers occupying a war zone rather than members of the community who are there to serve and protect. So I think it really increases the divide between police and the rest of the community. And it's that connection that's really so important to their role as a public servant. So it's not a matter of not wanting our police to be better armed than the criminals. It's a matter of making sure that they remember that their goal is to protect and serve, not to act like an occupying force with superior firepower.
Now, I want to talk to you about some broader topics and what we can do to make a difference when we come back. Can you hang around for a little bit?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with Captain Bernard after this.
The Nick Knight Show, sponsored by Audi of America. Truth in engineering.